Jonathan Pierce sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. The numbers blurred together, just like they had every day for the past 2 years. Outside, the city stretched endlessly beneath him, millions of lives moving forward while his felt permanently stuck. He glanced at his watch. 6:30. The girls would be finishing dinner soon. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister-in-law, Rachel. "How are my nieces doing? And you?" He typed back a quick "fine, everyone's good," and set the phone down. It was easier than explaining that he didn't really know how anyone was doing, including himself. 2 years ago, his wife Victoria had lost her battle with cancer. 2 years, and he still couldn't walk past her photo in the hallway without feeling like someone had punched him in the chest. Their daughters, Lily and Grace, were only 5 and 7 when it happened. Now they were 7 and 9, growing up so fast he could barely keep track. The first year after Victoria died was a blur of babysitters and daycare extensions. He'd tried to be there for every school event, every bedtime, but his company demanded attention too. The tech firm he'd built from nothing was going through a major expansion, and investors weren't sympathetic to personal problems. He'd hired and fired 6 different nannies in 8 months. One was always on her phone. Another let the girls eat cookies for breakfast. One didn't show up half the time. Another talked about her relationship problems constantly, which seemed wildly inappropriate given that his daughters had just lost their mother. He was exhausted. The girls were struggling, and he was failing at being both parents. That's when Rachel suggested Maya Rodriguez. She'd heard about her through a friend whose kids Maya had cared for. "She's different," Rachel had said over coffee one Sunday morning. "Patient, kind, and the kids absolutely loved her. Just meet her. What's the worst that could happen?" Jonathan had been skeptical. He'd heard promises before, but when Maya arrived for the interview on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, something shifted. She was 28 with warm brown eyes and a smile that lit up her whole face. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she crouched down to Lily's level when the shy 7-year-old peeked around the corner. The way she asked Grace about the drawing she was working on and actually listened to the rambling explanation about unicorns and rainbows. "Your mom would be really proud of this," Maya had said softly, pointing to Victoria's name written in wobbly letters at the bottom of the picture. Grace's eyes had welled up, but Maya didn't panic or change the subject like so many others had. She just sat there, present and calm, until Grace nodded and went back to coloring. Jonathan hired her on the spot. That was 4 months ago, and the change in his household had been remarkable. He'd come home one evening to find the kitchen actually clean, not just surface-level tidy but properly organized. The girls' homework was spread out on the dining table, and Maya was patiently explaining long division to Grace while Lily practiced her spelling words. There was music playing softly in the background, something cheerful and light. "Daddy!" Lily had launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "Maya taught us how to make pasta from scratch. Real pasta. And we didn't even use the box." Grace had rolled her eyes with all the drama a 9-year-old could muster. "It was basically just flour and eggs, Dad, not that complicated." But she'd been smiling. Actually smiling. That alone was worth whatever he was paying Maya. The house started to feel like a home again instead of a museum of grief. Maya had this gentle way of keeping Victoria's memory alive without making it painful. She'd find little moments to mention her. "I bet your mom loved when you danced like that." Or, "Your mom had great taste in books." Never forced, never heavy. Just natural mentions that reminded the girls their mother had existed and mattered. Jonathan found himself working later, staying at the office until 7 or 8 instead of rushing home by 6. Not because he wanted to avoid his daughters, but because he knew they were okay. Better than okay. They were laughing again, playing again, being kids again. But he'd started noticing something odd about 3 weeks into this new routine. Maya's contract hours were 9 to 6, Monday through Friday. Yet somehow she was still there most evenings when he got home around 8. He'd walk in to find her tidying up the kitchen or folding laundry in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across her tired face. "Maya, you don't have to stay this late," he'd said the first time, feeling guilty. "I can handle the evening routine." She'd just smiled and shaken her head. "It's no trouble, really. I want to make sure everything's done properly." He'd insisted on paying her overtime, but she'd refused. "You're already paying me more than fairly," she'd said. "Consider it my contribution to two wonderful girls who deserve the best." After the third time this happened, Jonathan made a decision. "I'm driving you home," he'd announced one Thursday evening as she gathered her things. "It's late, and you shouldn't be taking public transportation at this hour." Maya had hesitated, her fingers tightening around her bag strap. "That's really not necessary. The bus stop is just a few blocks away." "I insist," Jonathan had said firmly. "Besides, it's the least I can do after you've stayed so late helping out." The drive that first night had been quiet at first, both of them adjusting to the strange intimacy of being in a car together after hours. But then Maya had asked about his day, and somehow they'd fallen into an easy conversation about the girls, about the funny thing Lily had said during breakfast, about Grace's upcoming science fair project. Jonathan found himself actually relaxing for the first time in months. Maya had this way of listening that made you want to keep talking. She didn't offer unwanted advice or try to fix everything. She just nodded and asked thoughtful questions and made you feel heard. "Turn left up here," she directed as they approached a neighborhood he didn't know well. "And then you can drop me off at that corner, the one with the streetlight." He'd pulled over where she indicated, in front of a modest apartment building with peeling paint and a flickering entrance light. "You sure this is okay? I can take you to the door." "This is perfect, thank you so much," Maya had said quickly, already opening the door. "I really appreciate the ride. See you tomorrow." She'd disappeared into the night before he could respond. It became their routine after that. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. Jonathan would drive Maya home around 8 or 8:30. They'd talk about the girls, about work, about nothing important and everything important. He learned that she loved old movies, especially the black and white ones. That she'd always wanted to visit Italy. That she made the best chocolate chip cookies because her grandmother had taught her the secret was using brown butter. But every single time she asked to be dropped off at that same corner. Never at the building entrance. Never anywhere else. Always that specific spot under the streetlight. And then she'd hurry away into the darkness while he watched in his rearview mirror. Jonathan told himself it wasn't his business. Maybe she was embarrassed about her living situation. Maybe she had a roommate who was difficult. Maybe she just valued her privacy. He was her employer, not her friend, despite how comfortable their conversations had become. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. One evening, about 6 weeks into their driving routine, Jonathan found himself circling back after dropping Maya off. He told himself he was just making sure she got inside safely, that he was being responsible, that this wasn't weird or invasive. He parked half a block away, engine off, watching the corner where he'd left her. Maya appeared in the glow of the streetlight, her bag slung over her shoulder. She walked toward the apartment building he'd assumed was hers, and Jonathan felt relieved. See, nothing strange. Just a private person who didn't like being walked to the door. But then Maya walked right past the building. Didn't slow down, didn't look at it, just kept walking. She turned down a side street and vanished from view. Jonathan sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. Where was she going? Why had she lied about where she lived? Was she in trouble? Danger? The next day at work, he couldn't concentrate. His assistant asked 3 times if he was feeling all right. He snapped at his CFO during a meeting about nothing important. His mind kept cycling through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was Maya hiding from someone? An abusive ex? He'd checked her references thoroughly before hiring her. But maybe she'd been running from something. Maybe she was involved in something illegal. Maybe those perfect references had been faked. But even as these thoughts spiraled, another voice in his head pushed back. This was Maya, the woman who made his daughters laugh, who remembered that Lily liked her sandwiches cut into triangles and Grace preferred circles, who'd helped them plant a memorial garden for their mother in the backyard with Victoria's favorite flowers. Still, he had to know. He had to make sure his daughters were safe. That evening, Jonathan left work early. He drove home, made an excuse about needing to run an errand, and waited in his car down the street from his house. At 8:15, Maya emerged from the front door, her familiar bag over her shoulder. She started walking toward the bus stop. Jonathan followed at a distance, his heart pounding. He felt ridiculous. Maya walked for blocks, much longer than she would have needed to get to any bus that went toward her supposed apartment. Jonathan stayed far enough back that she wouldn't notice him, ducking into doorways when she paused at intersections. The neighborhood changed as they went, becoming less polished, more worn. Streetlights were farther apart here. Buildings showed their age in cracked facades and broken windows. Jonathan felt a twist of worry in his gut. What was Maya doing in this part of town? Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of walking, Maya turned down a street Jonathan didn't recognize. He followed carefully, keeping to the shadows. She stopped in front of a large brick building with a small sign out front that was hard to read in the dim light. Jonathan squinted, moving closer while staying hidden behind a parked van. His heart was hammering now, his mouth dry. The sign came into focus. Riverside Women's Shelter. Maya pulled out a key, unlocked the side door, and disappeared inside. Jonathan stood there on the dark street, completely frozen. His mind couldn't make sense of what he'd just seen. Maya was staying at a women's shelter, but she seemed so put together, so professional. Had she been hiding homelessness this whole time? How had he not noticed? But even as shock flooded through him, another feeling rose up stronger. Protectiveness. His daughter's nanny, the woman who'd brought light back into their home, was struggling far more than she'd ever let on. And she'd been hiding it, probably out of fear of losing her job, of being judged, of being seen as less capable. Jonathan walked slowly back to his car, his mind spinning. He needed to help. He needed to do something, but what? He couldn't just confront her. She'd be mortified, might quit. And his girls needed her. They'd finally found stability again. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to figure out his next move. One thing was certain. Things were about to change. He just didn't realize yet how completely everything would transform, or that what he'd discovered tonight wasn't even close to the full truth. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift across the room as car headlights passed by outside. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maya walking into that shelter, her shoulders slightly hunched, her pace quick like she didn't want to be seen. A women's shelter. The words kept echoing in his mind. How had things gotten so bad for her? And more importantly, how had she managed to hide it so completely? She showed up every morning looking professional and put together. Her clothes were always clean, if a bit worn. She never complained, never asked for advances on her paycheck, never gave any indication that she was struggling. He thought about his own problems over the past 2 years. Grief, sure. Loneliness, absolutely. But he'd never worried about where he'd sleep at night. Never wondered if he could afford his next meal. His privilege felt heavy in the darkness of his bedroom, suffocating almost. By the time the sun came up, Jonathan had made a decision. He needed to know more. Not to be nosy or invasive, but to help. If Maya was in a bad situation, he had the resources to do something about it. He just needed to be careful about how he approached it. At breakfast, Lily chattered about a field trip coming up while Grace pushed her cereal around her bowl, lost in her own thoughts. Jonathan watched them and thought about what Maya had given them these past few months. Stability, laughter, a sense that life could still be good even after loss. He owed it to her to help if he could. "Is Maya coming today?" Lily asked, milk dribbling down her chin. "Of course she is," Grace answered before Jonathan could. "She comes every day, dummy." "Don't call your sister names," Jonathan said automatically, but his heart wasn't in the correction. He was already planning his next move. When Maya arrived at 9, she looked the same as always. Bright smile, warm greeting, immediately diving into the morning routine with the girls. Jonathan watched her more carefully than usual, looking for signs of strain. There were small things he'd missed before. The way she rolled her shoulders like they ached. The slight purple shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. The fact that she always ate a big breakfast with the girls, like maybe it was the only solid meal she knew she'd get that day. The guilt twisted deeper in his chest. He went to work, but couldn't focus. His secretary buzzed him 3 times about meetings he'd completely forgotten. He stared at spreadsheets without processing any of the numbers. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, he made a call he'd never thought he'd make. "Davidson Investigations, how can I help you?" Jonathan cleared his throat. "I need to hire a private investigator." He felt sleazy even saying it. Who hires a PI to look into their nanny? But he kept thinking about the shelter, about Maya's tired eyes, about his daughter's safety. He needed to know what was really going on. The investigator, a woman named Patricia Chen, met him in a coffee shop that evening. She was in her 50s. professional and direct with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully rehearsed explanation. "Let me be clear," Jonathan said, stirring his coffee nervously. "This isn't about not trusting her. She's wonderful with my daughters. I just saw something that concerned me, and I want to make sure she's not in danger, that my family's not in danger." Patricia nodded, taking notes. "You want a background check? Employment history, financial situation, criminal record, current living situation?" "Yes, but discreetly. I don't want her to know I'm looking into her." "Mr. Pierce," Patricia said, looking up from her notepad, "I've been doing this for 23 years. Discretion is what you're paying for. 3 days. That's how long Patricia said it would take. 3 days that dragged by like 3 years. Jonathan found himself watching Maya even more closely, hating himself for it but unable to stop. She sang while she cooked dinner. She helped Grace with her math homework, explaining fractions in a way that finally made sense. She braided Lily's hair into elaborate patterns that made the little girl feel like a princess. How could someone dealing with homelessness be so present, so giving, so utterly dedicated to other people's children? On the 4th day, Patricia called. "I have your report. Can you meet this afternoon?" Jonathan canceled 2 meetings and drove to Patricia's office in a strip mall across town. She handed him a folder that felt surprisingly thin for all the anxiety it had caused him. "Before you read this," Patricia said, sitting across from him, "I want to say something. In my line of work, I usually find dirt. Affairs, fraud, hidden addictions. This isn't that. What you're about to read is one of the most remarkable stories I've come across." Jonathan opened the folder with shaking hands. The first page was basic information he already knew. Maya Rodriguez, age 28, no criminal record, excellent employment references. But then he turned to the next page and his world tilted. Maya had been a medical student. Not just any medical student, but top of her class at Columbia University on a full academic scholarship, pediatrics track. She'd been 3 years into her degree when her parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. Jonathan's hands tightened on the paper. He'd lost Victoria and knew that grief, but his daughters had been young. Maya's siblings, according to the report, had been 12, 14, and 16 when they lost both parents, old enough to understand fully what they'd lost. He kept reading. Maya had been listed as their legal guardian. The oldest, a boy named Carlos, had been heading toward trouble before the accident. Skipping school, hanging with the wrong crowd. The middle child, Sophia, had anxiety so severe she couldn't leave the house for months. The youngest, Diego, had been the most stable but was still just a kid dealing with impossible grief. Maya had dropped out of medical school immediately. Not temporarily, permanently. She'd withdrawn from her classes, given up her scholarship, and taken the first job she could find that offered flexible hours and decent pay. Nannying, but that wasn't all. The report showed she'd worked multiple jobs over the past 5 years. Nannying during the day, cleaning offices at night, weekend retail shifts when she could find them. Every cent going toward rent for a 2-bedroom apartment and taking care of 3 traumatized teenagers. Jonathan had to put the folder down. His hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. "There's more," Patricia said quietly. "The shelter you saw her enter? She volunteers there, has for the past 2 years every Wednesday night. She provides free childcare for the mothers staying there, women who need to work evening shifts or just need a few hours of respite." "But I saw her use a key," Jonathan said, his voice coming out rough. "She had a key to get in. The director gave her one. She's there so regularly and they trust her so completely that they made her an unofficial staff member. She's not staying there, Mr. Pierce. She's giving her only free evening every week to help people who have even less than she does." Jonathan couldn't speak. He stared at the report, at the list of Maya's accomplishments before her parents died. Academic awards, research publications, a recommendation letter from a professor that called her the most naturally gifted student I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. A future that had been bright and clear and full of promise. All of it sacrificed for family. The apartment she lives in, Patricia continued, is in a rough neighborhood because that's what she can afford on a nanny's salary. According to property records and some discreet inquiries, she shares a 2-bedroom with her 3 siblings. Carlos just graduated high school and got accepted to community college. Sophia is a junior and seeing a therapist now, doing much better. Diego is a freshman and apparently a straight-A student. Jonathan put his head in his hands. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she ask for help? Patricia leaned back in her chair. People who've had to be strong for that long don't know how to stop being strong. They don't know how to ask. And maybe she was afraid you'd think she was unreliable, or that her situation would make her seem less capable, afraid she'd lose a good job that her family depends on. The drive home was a blur. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. He kept thinking about Maya's smile, about the way she never seemed to run out of patience with his daughters, about how she'd been dealing with 3 grieving teenagers while working multiple jobs and still found the energy to volunteer at a shelter. Meanwhile, what had he been doing? Wallowing in his own grief while sitting in his mansion, working late not because he had to, but because it was easier than dealing with emotions. He thought he was struggling, and he had been, but his struggles came with a safety net woven from money and resources and options. Maya's struggles came with the very real possibility of failure, of losing everything, of watching her siblings end up in foster care or worse. That evening, when he got home, Maya was in the kitchen helping Lily with a science project. Something about volcanoes and baking soda. The kitchen table was covered in newspaper and red food coloring. "Daddy, look," Lily shouted. "We made it erupt." Jonathan watched Maya laugh as baking soda foam spilled over the papier-mâché mountain. She grabbed paper towels, still laughing, helping Lily clean up the mess. There was red dye on her shirt now, but she didn't seem to care. This woman, who'd given up everything for her family, who worked herself to exhaustion, who had every reason to be bitter and angry at the world, was laughing over a messy science project like it was the most fun she'd had all week. "Maya," Jonathan said, his voice coming out strange even to his own ears. "Can we talk for a minute?" Her smile faltered slightly. She glanced at Lily, then back at him. "Of course. Girls, keep cleaning this up, okay? I'll be right back." They walked into Jonathan's study and he closed the door. Maya stood near the bookshelf, her hands clasped in front of her, looking nervous. In that moment, Jonathan realized she thought she was about to be fired. Of course she did. The boss asking for a private conversation never meant anything good. "Maya, I need to tell you something," Jonathan started, then stopped. "How did you admit you'd invaded someone's privacy? How did you explain that you'd been following them and hired an investigator? If this is about staying late," Maya jumped in quickly, "I promise it won't happen anymore. I know it's outside my contracted hours and I should have been more respectful of boundaries." "Maya, stop," Jonathan said gently. "You're not in trouble. I saw you last week. When I dropped you off, I circled back because I was worried. And I saw you walk past the apartment building. I saw you go to the shelter." The color drained from Maya's face. Her hands, still clasped together, started shaking. "Mr. Pierce, I can explain." "I hired an investigator," Jonathan said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know I shouldn't have. It was an invasion of your privacy, and I apologize for that. But I needed to know that you weren't in danger, that my daughters weren't in danger. And what I found out—" He paused, his throat tight. "Maya, why didn't you tell me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Tell you what? That I gave up on my dreams? That I'm barely keeping my head above water? That some weeks I have to choose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill?" Her voice rose, all the emotion she'd been holding back for months finally breaking through. "You hired me to take care of your children, Mr. Pierce, not to burden you with my problems." "You're not a burden," Jonathan said firmly, "and you didn't give up on your dreams. You chose your family. That's not giving up. That's the most courageous thing a person can do." Maya wiped at her eyes angrily. "It doesn't feel courageous. It feels like I'm failing. Carlos is 18 now and wants to work full-time instead of going to college because he knows money is tight. Sophia still has nightmares. Diego is growing out of his shoes every 3 months and I can barely keep up. And I'm so tired, Mr. Pierce. I'm so tired all the time." The dam had broken. All the strength Maya had been projecting, all the positivity and energy, crumbled in that moment. She sank into the chair by Jonathan's desk and put her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jonathan stood there, this folder full of information about her life clutched in his hands, and realized that knowing the facts wasn't the same as understanding the weight. The bone-deep exhaustion of working multiple jobs, the constant stress of never having enough, the guilt of watching your siblings struggle and feeling responsible, the grief of a future you'd planned that would never happen. "I want to help," he said quietly. Maya looked up at him, mascara running down her cheeks. "I can't accept charity, Mr. Pierce. I appreciate the offer, really. But I've made it this far on my own. I'll figure it out." "It's not charity," Jonathan said. though he wasn't entirely sure what it was yet. He just knew that he couldn't let this continue. Couldn't watch someone as extraordinary as Maya continue to barely survive when he had the means to change everything. But he could see in her eyes that she wouldn't accept help easily. Pride maybe, or fear, or just that bone-deep independence that comes from having to rely only on yourself for too long. This was going to take more thought, more planning. He needed to find a way to help that wouldn't make Maya feel like a charity case, that wouldn't damage the trust his daughters had in her, that would actually make a difference. As Maya composed herself and went back to the girls, apologizing for the emotional outburst, Jonathan sat alone in his study with the investigator's report spread across his desk. Everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. The question now was what he was going to do about it. And he had a feeling that whatever decision he made next would alter not just Maya's life, but his own and his daughter's lives as well. He just didn't realize yet how completely everything was about to transform. Jonathan didn't sleep again that night, but this time it was different. His mind wasn't spinning with worry or confusion. It was racing with plans, ideas, possibilities. Every time he thought he'd figured out the perfect solution, he'd realize it wouldn't work. Too direct, too much like charity, too likely to make Maya feel uncomfortable or indebted. By 3 a.m, he'd filled half a notebook with scratched-out ideas. Just give her more money. No, she'd refuse or feel obligated. Pay for an apartment for her family. No, too personal, too invasive. Offer to pay for her to go back to medical school. No, she'd never accept leaving her siblings or giving up the income from working. He tossed the notebook aside and stared at the ceiling. Victoria would have known what to do. She'd always been better at this kind of thing, at helping people without making them feel small. She'd had this gift for making generosity feel natural, like you were doing her the favor instead of the other way around. What would you do? He whispered into the darkness of their bedroom. Their bedroom. He still thought of it that way, even though she'd been gone for 2 years. No answer came, of course. But as he lay there in the silence, a memory surfaced. It was about 6 months before Victoria got sick. They'd been at a charity gala, and she'd pulled him aside, annoyed with something. These people, she'd said, gesturing at the wealthy crowd around them, they write checks and think they've solved poverty. They throw money at problems without understanding that what people really need is opportunity, dignity, a chance to build something themselves. So what should they do instead? Jonathan had asked. Create opportunities that don't feel like handouts, jobs that pay fairly, scholarships that don't come with strings attached, housing that doesn't make people feel like they're living on someone else's charity. Give people the tools to lift themselves up, not just a temporary ladder that gets pulled away. The memory hit him like a physical blow. That was it. That was the answer. He didn't need to save Maya. He needed to give her the tools to save herself. Jonathan sat up in bed, his heart pounding with the kind of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He grabbed his phone and started making notes. Real workable notes this time. By the time the sun came up, he had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The first step was the easiest. He owned property beyond just his main house. When he and Victoria had bought this place 8 years ago, the estate had come with a guest house about 50 yards from the main building. It was small, maybe 1,200 square feet, but it had 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and its own entrance. Victoria had used it as an art studio for a while, and after she died, Jonathan had locked it up. He couldn't bear to go in there and see her half-finished paintings, her supplies still scattered around like she might come back any moment and pick up where she left off. But this could work. The guest house could be perfect for Maya and her siblings, close enough that she could still work easily, far enough that they'd have privacy, and he could frame it as a benefit of her employment, not charity. Live-in positions always came with housing, right? This would just be an extension of her job, except Maya wasn't live-in. She had set hours and went home every day. He'd have to figure out how to make this offer without it seeming completely random. The second part of his plan was trickier: medical school. Maya had given up her dream, but that dream didn't have to stay buried. There were part-time programs, online options, ways to work toward a degree while still maintaining an income. But he couldn't just offer to pay for it. She'd refuse immediately. That's when Jonathan remembered the scholarship fund Victoria had wanted to set up. They'd talked about it extensively during her illness. She'd been a teacher before having kids, and education had mattered to her more than almost anything. She'd wanted to create a scholarship specifically for women who'd had to interrupt their education due to family circumstances. Women who chose family over career shouldn't have to give up on their dreams permanently, she'd said. They should get a second chance. They'd never gotten around to setting it up before she died, and afterward, Jonathan had been too deep in grief to follow through. But he could do it now. He could create the Victoria Pierce Memorial Scholarship Fund, establish real criteria and a selection committee, and make sure Maya qualified. It wouldn't be charity. It would be a legitimate scholarship that she earned. By the time Lily and Grace came down for breakfast, Jonathan was already on his second pot of coffee and had drafted the basic framework for the scholarship fund. He felt more energized than he had in months, maybe years. "Dad, you look weird," Grace announced, studying him suspiciously over her cereal bowl. "Weird how?" Jonathan asked. "I don't know." "Happy? It's creepy," Lily giggled. "You do look different, Daddy. Did something good happen?" "Maybe," Jonathan said, ruffling her hair. "I'm working on something. You'll see." When Maya arrived that morning, she looked exhausted. Her eyes were puffy like she'd been crying, and she moved slower than usual. The conversation from the previous night hung between them like a heavy fog. She barely made eye contact with Jonathan, focusing entirely on the girls. "Maya," Jonathan said gently, catching her in the kitchen while the girls were getting their backpacks ready for school. "About last night. I'm sorry if I upset you. That wasn't my intention." She shook her head quickly. "You have nothing to apologize for, Mr. Pierce. I'm the one who broke down unprofessionally. It won't happen again." "I don't want you to shut down on me," Jonathan said. "And I definitely don't want you to feel like you have to pretend everything's fine when it's not. You've been incredible for my daughters. You've helped put our family back together. I just want to return the favor if I can." Maya's eyes welled up again, but she blinked the tears back. "I appreciate that. I really do. But I'm okay. I've been handling things for 5 years. I can keep handling them." Jonathan wanted to argue, to tell her that she shouldn't have to just handle things, that life could be better than merely surviving. But he could see the walls going back up, the professional mask sliding into place. Pushing now would only make her retreat further. "Okay," he said simply, "but the offer stands. If you ever need anything, just ask." She nodded and went back to helping the girls. But Jonathan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself carefully, like she might shatter if she relaxed even slightly. Over the next week, Jonathan threw himself into his plan. He met with lawyers to set up the scholarship fund properly, with an endowment large enough to support multiple students for years to come. He established a committee of educators and nonprofit leaders to review applications, people who had no connection to him or Maya and wouldn't know about his ulterior motive. He created criteria that were specific enough to target women in Maya's exact situation, but broad, enough that it wouldn't seem tailored just for her. He also called in a cleaning crew and had them clear out the guest house. It hurt, watching Victoria's art supplies get boxed up and moved to storage. Her paintings, some finished and some just sketches, got carefully wrapped and stored in the climate-controlled basement. The space was repainted, professionally cleaned, and furnished simply but comfortably. 3 bedrooms, one slightly larger than the others, a kitchen with new appliances, a living room with decent furniture that didn't look too expensive but wasn't shabby either. The hardest part was telling the girls. Jonathan sat them down one evening after Maya had left for the day. "I want to talk to you about something," he began. "You know how much you both love Maya, right?" "She's the best," Lily said immediately. Grace nodded, more reserved but clearly agreeing. "She's pretty cool." "Well, I found out that Maya's been going through a really hard time," Jonathan said carefully. "She's been taking care of her younger brother and sisters since their parents died, and it's been really difficult for her. She's been working really hard and doesn't have a lot of money." Lily's eyes went wide. "Maya's poor?" "She doesn't have as much as we do," Jonathan said. "And I was thinking about ways we could help her. How would you feel if Maya and her family came to live in Mommy's art house?" Grace's expression shifted, something complex crossing her face. The art house was the last place that still felt entirely like their mother. Even though they rarely went in there, knowing it existed, knowing her things were still there, had been a comfort. "Would we have to get rid of Mom's stuff?" Grace asked quietly. "No," Jonathan said firmly. "We'd move it carefully and keep everything safe. But Mom always wanted that space to be used to help people, I think she'd be really happy knowing it was helping Maya. And Maya would still be our nanny? Lily asked. Of course. She'd actually be around even more. You'd get to see her siblings, too. Carlos is 18, Sophia is 16, and Diego is 14. Grace chewed on her lip, thinking. Would they be like our family? Jonathan's throat tightened. I think they could be. If everyone wanted that? Okay, Grace said finally. I think Mom would like that. She always said our house was too big for just us. Lily bounced in her seat. Can we help decorate? Can we pick out stuff for their rooms? Maybe, Jonathan said, smiling. But first we have to convince Maya to say yes. And that might be the hardest part. He wasn't wrong. When Jonathan finally brought up the idea 2 days later, Maya's immediate reaction was to shake her head. Mr. Pierce, I can't accept that. It's too much. They were in his study again, and Jonathan had prepared for this. It's not too much. It's practical. You're working long hours and the commute is eating into time you could spend with your siblings or, honestly, sleeping. Living on site would make your job easier. Plus, the house is just sitting empty. It makes sense. Living on site would make me live in help, Maya said carefully. That changes our entire arrangement. Not if we don't want it to, Jonathan countered. Your hours would stay the same. You'd just be eliminating the commute. Think of it as a work benefit. Like a company car. Lots of employers provide housing. Maya looked torn, her hands twisting together in her lap. And what about when you don't need a nanny anymore? When the girls are older, then what? We'd have to uproot again, find another place to live. It's not stable. Jonathan had thought about this. The scholarship fund, he said. I'm setting up a scholarship in Victoria's name for women who've had to interrupt their education for family reasons. You'd be a perfect candidate. If you got the scholarship, you could go back to medical school part-time while still working and living here. By the time the girls don't need a nanny anymore, you'd be close to finishing your degree. A scholarship, Maya repeated slowly, that you're setting up. For someone in my exact situation. That's not suspicious at all. It's a legitimate scholarship with a real committee and everything, Jonathan said. And you're not the only person in the world who's had to drop out of school to care for family. You'd have to apply like everyone else. But yes, I'm setting it up because Victoria always wanted to, and because your situation made me realize how important it is. Maya stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens. Jonathan waited, his heart pounding. This had to be her choice. He couldn't push too hard or she'd refuse out of pride. Why are you doing this? Maya asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Why do you care so much? Jonathan thought about all the reasons. Because his daughters loved her. Because she'd brought light back into his dark house. Because she reminded him that there was still good in the world. Because helping her felt like honoring Victoria's memory. Because it was the right thing to do. Because you deserve better than just surviving, he said simply. You deserve a chance to thrive. And I have the means to give you that chance. Why wouldn't I? Maya turned back to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. What if I fail? What if I can't handle medical school and working and taking care of my siblings? What if I mess everything up? Then you adjust, Jonathan said. You take a break if you need to. You figure it out. But at least you'd be trying. At least you'd have a shot at the future you wanted. The silence stretched between them. Jonathan could see Maya warring with herself. Pride battling with exhaustion, independence fighting against the desperate need for help. Can I think about it? She asked finally. And talk to my siblings? This affects them too. Of course, Jonathan said. Take all the time you need. The offer isn't going anywhere. But as Maya left that evening, Jonathan felt a flutter of hope. She hadn't said no. She'd said she needed to think. That was progress. 3 days later, Maya asked if she could bring her siblings to meet Jonathan and see the guest house. Jonathan's palms were sweating as he waited for them to arrive that Saturday afternoon. The girls were beside themselves with excitement, having helped him set up a small welcome spread of snacks and drinks. When Maya's old car pulled up, Jonathan watched as 3 teenagers climbed out. Carlos was tall and lanky, with wary eyes that took in everything. Sophia was quieter, staying close to Maya's side. Diego was the youngest, all nervous energy and barely contained curiosity. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Mr. Pierce, Carlos said formally, shaking Jonathan's hand with a grip that was probably meant to be firm but came across as defensive. Call me Jonathan, he said. All of you. Come on, I'll show you around. The tour of the guest house was awkward at first. The teenagers moved through the space carefully like they were afraid to touch anything. But gradually they relaxed. Diego asked about the internet speed. Sofia quietly admired the kitchen. Carlos inspected everything with the protective eye of someone who'd been the man of the house for 5 years. "This is really nice," Carlos said finally, standing in the living room. "Too nice." "What's the catch?" "Carlos," Maya said sharply. "No, it's a fair question," Jonathan said. "The catch is that I need a good nanny for my daughters, and Maya is the best one I've found. This arrangement makes her life easier, which means she can focus on her job. That's it. That's the whole catch. And the scholarship thing?" Carlos pressed. "Maya told us about that." "That's separate," Jonathan said. "It's a real scholarship that my wife wanted to set up before she died. I'm finally following through. Maya would have to apply and qualify like anyone else." Carlos studied him for a long moment, then looked at his younger siblings. Some silent communication passed between them. Finally, he turned back to Jonathan. "Maya's been taking care of us since we were kids. She gave up everything for us. If this helps her get back to her dreams, then I'm in. But if this is some kind of weird power trip thing, or if you try to hold this over her head, you'll have me to deal with. Got it?" Jonathan respected the threat even if he could see the boy's hand shaking slightly. "Got it. And for what it's worth, I'm not looking for power or control. I'm just trying to help." Sofia spoke for the first time, her voice soft. "Can we really live here? Like this would be our home?" "If Maya agrees," Jonathan said. "This would be your home, for as long as you need it." He watched Maya's face as her siblings explored the bedrooms, calling out to each other about which room they wanted. The tension in her shoulders finally released. The walls she'd been holding up so carefully finally came down. And when she looked at Jonathan, there was something new in her eyes. Trust. "Okay," she said quietly. "We'll do it. We'll try." Jonathan felt something shift in that moment, something he hadn't felt since Victoria died. Purpose, direction, the sense that life was moving forward again instead of just cycling through the motions. He had no idea yet just how completely this decision would change all of their lives. But standing there, watching Maya's siblings laugh with his daughters as they raced through the guest house, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd done something his wife would be proud of, and that was enough. For now, that was more than enough. Moving day was chaos in the best possible way. Jonathan had offered to hire professional movers, but Maya insisted they could handle it themselves. "We don't have that much stuff," she'd said, which turned out to be heartbreakingly true. Everything Maya's family owned fit into her beat-up sedan and Carlos's friend's pickup truck in 2 trips. Jonathan watched from his porch as they unloaded boxes that had clearly been used multiple times, the cardboard worn and retaped. The furniture from their old apartment was minimal. A few beds, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs, lamps that had seen better days. It hurt to see how little they had, how much they'd been struggling. "Dad, can we help?" Lily asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Let's give them some space to settle in first," Jonathan said, though he wanted nothing more than to rush over and help carry boxes. But he'd learned over the past week that Maya needed to maintain some sense of independence, some feeling that she was still in control of her own life. By evening, the guest house lights were on, and Jonathan could see shadows moving behind the curtains. His property felt different now, more alive somehow. Less like a monument to the past and more like a place where life was actually happening. Grace appeared at his elbow. "Can we invite them for dinner?" Jonathan smiled. "I think that's a great idea. Why don't you go ask?" 10 minutes later, all 7 of them were crowded around Jonathan's dining table. It was the most people who'd sat there since Victoria died, and for a moment Jonathan felt overwhelmed by the noise and energy. Diego and Lily were already chattering away like old friends. Sofia sat quietly next to Grace, who was showing her something on her phone. Carlos was more reserved, but even he seemed to be relaxing slightly. Maya caught Jonathan's eye across the table and mouthed, "Thank you." He just nodded, not trusting himself to speak around the lump in his throat. The first few weeks of the new arrangement had its awkward moments. Jonathan wasn't used to having other people on his property. He'd catch himself feeling like his privacy had been invaded when he'd see Carlos shooting basketball hoops in the driveway, or hear music drifting from the guest house windows. But then he'd remember that he'd invited this, wanted this, and the feeling would pass. The girls adapted faster than he did. Lily was in heaven having Diego around. The 14-year-old was patient with her constant questions and let her tag along when he explored the property. Grace and Sophia formed a quieter friendship, often sitting together doing homework or just reading in comfortable silence. Carlos was the hardest to reach. He maintained a polite distance, always saying Mr. Pierce despite Jonathan's repeated requests to use his first name. He worked part-time at a grocery store and was taking classes at community college, and he was rarely around during the day. When he was home, he stayed mostly in the guest house like he was afraid of taking up too much space. "Give him time," Maya said one evening when Jonathan mentioned it. "He's been the man of the house for 5 years. It's hard for him to let that go and accept help. He thinks accepting help means he failed somehow." Jonathan understood that feeling better than he cared to admit. The real change came about a month after they moved in. Jonathan came home from work to find complete pandemonium. Lily was crying on the front steps, Diego was pacing nearby looking panicked, and he could hear shouting coming from inside the house. "What happened?" Jonathan asked, his heart racing. "Sophia had a panic attack," Diego said quickly. "A bad one. She hasn't had one this bad in over a year. Grace tried to help, but it made it worse, and now Grace is freaking out too." Jonathan rushed inside to find Grace in tears on the couch, while Maya knelt beside Sophia, who was hyperventilating on the floor. Carlos hovered nearby, his face pale. "Sophia, honey, look at me," Maya was saying calmly. "Count with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Can you do that?" But Sophia couldn't seem to focus, her breath coming in gasps, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm calling 911, Carlos said, pulling out his phone. "Wait," Jonathan said, moving closer. "Sophia, can you hear me?" She looked at him, eyes unfocused. "I get these too sometimes," Jonathan said quietly, sitting down on the floor across from her. "Since my wife died, the world gets too loud and too bright, and it feels like you can't breathe. Like you're drowning in air." Sophia's gasping slowed slightly. She was listening. "What helps me is finding 5 things I can see." Jonathan continued, his voice steady and calm. "Can you try that with me?" 5 things. Look around. Tell me one thing you can see. The lamp," Sophia whispered. "Good, that's 1. What else?" Your watch. That's 2. 3 more." Slowly, methodically, Jonathan walked Sophia through the grounding exercise. 5 things she could see. 4 things she could touch. 3 things she could hear. By the time they finished, her breathing had evened out and the wild look had left her eyes. "I'm sorry," Sophia said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," Jonathan said firmly. "You had a panic attack. It happens. It's happened to me more times than I can count." Maya was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Carlos had slowly lowered his phone, the 911 call forgotten. "You get panic attacks?" Grace asked from the couch, her voice small. Jonathan turned to look at his daughter. "Sometimes. Usually at night. Sometimes at work. They're scary, but they pass. Just like Sophia's did." "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Grace asked. "I guess I thought I was protecting you," Jonathan said. "I didn't want you to worry. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe we should all be more honest about when we're struggling."